The weight of truth. There are few moments in the grim annals of the 31st millennium more profound than the silence that followed the siege of Terra. In the deepest vaults of the imperial palace, where golden light had once blazed with the certainty of absolute truth, now only shadows lingered. The Emperor of mankind lay broken upon the golden throne, his perfect form shattered not by enemy blade, but by the betrayal of his most beloved son. Yet it was not the sight of divine flesh torn and bleeding that would shake the foundations of loyalty itself. It was what Constantin Valdor would discover in the hours that followed. The Captain General of the Legio Custodes stood vigil beside the throne, his auramite armor dulled with the dust of battle and the weight of unthinkable loss. For 10,000 years the custodians had served without question, their loyalty forged not merely in gene craft and conditioning, but in absolute faith. Valdor had been the first of his kind, shaped by the Emperor's own hands when the world was young, and the stars themselves seemed within reach. Now, as he watched the labored breathing of his master, something stirred within him that he had never known before. Doubt. The techno-adepts swarmed around the golden throne like carrion beetles, their mechadendrites weaving complex patterns as they prepared the life-sustaining mechanisms that would preserve what remained of the master of mankind. The work would take hours, perhaps days. In that time, someone would need to access the Emperor's personal archives to retrieve the sacred protocols that would guide the Imperium through this darkest hour. The duty fell to Valdor, as it had always fallen to him. He was the keeper of the Emperor's secrets, the guardian of truths too dangerous for lesser minds. Yet as he descended into the vaults that held the deepest mysteries of the imperial palace, he carried with him the first seeds of a terrible awakening. The archives stretched beyond sight, vast halls filled with data stacks and memory cores that held the accumulated wisdom of the Great Crusade. Here were the battle plans that had conquered 1,000,000 worlds, the genetic templates that had birthed the Primarchs, the technological wonders that had lifted humanity from the ashes of old night. Valdor moved through them with practiced efficiency, his enhanced mind cataloguing and cross-referencing with mechanical precision. But as he accessed the deepest layers of the Emperor's personal files, patterns began to emerge that chilled him more than the void between stars. The first discovery came as he reviewed the records of the Council of Nicaea, that fateful gathering where the Emperor had forbidden the use of psychic powers among his space marine legions. The official record spoke of necessary caution, of the dangers posed by uncontrolled psychers in the ranks of the Astartes. But here, in files marked with the Emperor's personal cipher, lay a different truth. The Emperor had known exactly what the warp contained. Not merely dangerous energies, but sentient beings of immense power who fed upon the emotions and beliefs of mortals. Beings that had been given names in the most ancient texts: Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slanesh, the gods of chaos. Valdor's hands trembled as he read further. The imperial truth, that fundamental doctrine which declared the universe to be rational and free from supernatural influence, had been a deliberate lie. The Emperor had known of the Chaos Gods from the very beginning of the Great Crusade, had understood their nature and their hunger. Yet he had chosen to deny this knowledge to his sons, to his generals, to the very warriors who fought in his name. Why? The answer lay in the next data stack, and it struck Valdor like a thunderbolt. Religion and superstition were indeed doorways through which chaos entered the minds of men. But ignorance, it seemed, was no protection at all. The scope of the deception began to unfold before him like a vast and terrible tapestry. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King of Prospero, had been censured and humiliated at Nicaea not for his defiance, but because his knowledge came too close to the truth the Emperor sought to conceal. The psychic powers of the Primarchs had not been an unforeseen consequence of their creation, but a necessary component of the Emperor's grand design. They were to be weapons against chaos, yet they had been kept deliberately ignorant of their true enemy. It was a strategy built upon lies, and it had led directly to the very heresy that had brought the Emperor low. Valdor accessed another cluster of files, these bearing temporal markers from the earliest days of the Great Crusade. Here were communications between the Emperor and his closest advisors, discussions of strategy and philosophy that painted a picture far removed from the noble rhetoric of unity and enlightenment. Humanity was not a species to be guided and protected, but a resource to be harvested and shaped. The imperial truth was not a philosophy, but a tool of control. Even the Primarchs themselves were spoken of in terms of function and utility, each designed for specific purposes in a war their father had chosen not to fully reveal. The weight of revelation pressed down upon Valdor like the gravity of a dying star. He thought of Horus, the beloved war master, whose fall had torn the galaxy apart. What if that fall had not been the result of chaos corruption alone, but of a son's growing awareness that his father's love was conditional upon his usefulness? What if the seeds of heresy had been planted not by the dark gods, but by the Emperor's own refusal to trust those who served him most faithfully? The questions multiplied like viral infections, each one weakening the foundations of everything the Valdor had believed. Yet the worst was still to come. In the deepest layers of the archives, protected by encryption that would have taken centuries to break without the highest authorization, lay the records of the Webway project. Valdor had known of its existence, of course. He had overseen the construction teams and guarded the entrance in the palace dungeons. But he had not understood its true scope, its ultimate purpose. The Emperor had not merely sought to build a network of tunnels through the warp. He had intended to sever humanity's connection to the immaterial realm entirely, to create a sterile pocket of reality where human potential could be guided and controlled without the interference of outside forces. The project had failed, shattered by Magnus's desperate attempt to warn his father of Horus's corruption. But the records revealed something that made Valdor's blood run cold. The Emperor had known that Magnus would breach the psychic barriers around Terra. He had foreseen the catastrophic damage to the Webway project, had calculated the probable outcomes with mathematical precision, and he had allowed it to happen anyway, because the alternative, trusting Magnus with the truth about chaos, would have required abandoning the fundamental deception upon which the entire imperial enterprise was built. As Valdor closed the final data file and stepped back from the archive terminal, he felt as though the very ground beneath his feet had become uncertain. For 10 millennia, he had been the perfect weapon, the ultimate guardian, shaped by the Emperor's will and bound by loyalty that transcended death itself. Now, as he stared up at the vaulted ceiling of the archive chamber, he understood that even that loyalty had been a lie, not a noble choice freely given, but a chain forged in gene craft and psychology, designed to ensure absolute obedience without the inconvenience of moral judgment. The Emperor had lied to his sons. He had lied to his people. He had lied to the galaxy itself about the nature of reality and the price of survival. And perhaps most damning of all, he had lied to the Custodes about the nature of their own service. They were not guardians of humanity's greatest hero, but wardens of its greatest tyrant. The golden armor that had seemed so noble now felt like prison bars, and the oath of loyalty that had defined Voldor's existence for 10,000 years had become a mockery. Yet even as these thoughts raced through his enhanced mind, Constantin Valdor remained motionless in the archive chamber. The Captain General of the Legio Custodes, first among the Emperor's chosen, felt the first cracks appearing in the absolute certainty that had defined his existence. Above him, the golden throne hummed with borrowed life, sustaining a being whose divinity had been built upon the deliberate ignorance of those who served him. The war for Terra was over, but another war, more terrible and more necessary, was about to begin. The weight of truth, Valdor realized, was far heavier than the weight of gold. The golden cage, the deepest chambers of the imperial palace, had witnessed many secrets, but none so dangerous as the one that now burned in Constantin Valdor's mind. 3 days had passed since his discovery in the archives, 3 days of maintaining the facade of absolute loyalty, while the foundations of his faith crumbled like ancient stone. The Emperor's life signs remained stable upon the golden throne, sustained by machinery that hummed with the same deceptive certainty that had once defined the Captain General's existence. Yet Valdor could no longer stand alone with the weight of truth. If the Legio Custodes were to survive what was coming, others would need to know. Tribune Armis Hadrex had served at Valdor's side for 7 centuries, his loyalty tested in the fires of 1,000 battlefields from the Unification Wars to the darkest days of the heresy. His auramite armor bore the scars of service to the throne, each mark a testament to oaths kept and duties fulfilled without question. Shield Captain Diocles was younger, elevated to the inner circle only 2 centuries past, but his tactical brilliance had earned him a place among the most trusted of the Emperor's guardians. Both had stood watch during the final assault on the palace, had seen their brothers die defending gates that should never have been breached. If any among the 10,000 could bear the burden of terrible knowledge, it was these 2. The meeting chamber lay 7 levels beneath the throne room, in vaults that predated even the palace's construction. Here, surrounded by archaeotech wards that could defeat any surveillance known to the Imperium, Valdor felt the weight of conspiracy settle upon his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The chamber's walls bore the Emperor's personal sigils, carved in an age when such symbols had seemed to represent something noble. Now they felt like accusations, silent witnesses to the betrayal of everything the Custodes had believed themselves to serve. Hadrex entered first, his movements betraying the wariness of a warrior who had survived too many battles to take any summons lightly. Diocles followed, his younger features marked by the strain of recent losses and the endless vigil that had followed the siege's end. Both wore their full panoply of war, guardian spears mag-locked to their armor, bolt weapons primed and ready. They trusted Valdor with their lives, but trust among the Custodes had always been tempered by pragmatism. In a galaxy where brother could turn against brother without warning, only the prepared survived. Valdor studied their faces as they took their positions, searching for any sign that the corruption he had discovered might already have taken root. But he saw only what he had always seen: absolute dedication, unshakable loyalty, the kind of faith that could move mountains or damn souls. It was that very faith that would make what came next so dangerous. The truth he carried was not merely information, but poison. Once spoken, it could never be taken back. Once heard, it would either destroy them or transform them into something the Legio Custodes had never been. Rebels, brothers, Valdor began, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded the Emperor's guard through 10 millennia of service. What I am about to tell you will shake the foundations of everything we have sworn to protect. Before I speak, know that there is no path back from this knowledge. You may choose to leave now, and I will think no less of you for it. But if you remain, You must be prepared to question not just our enemies, but the very nature of our service." Neither custodian moved. Hadrex's scarred features remained impassive, while Diocles leaned forward slightly, his tactical mind already working to process the implications of such words. They had followed Valdor through the darkest chapters of the Great Crusade, had trusted his judgment when the galaxy itself seemed to collapse around them. If their Captain General spoke of doubt, there would be reasons worthy of their attention. Valdor activated a data slate, its screen flickering to life with images and text that would have been classified beyond the reach of mortal eyes. The records from the Emperor's personal archives, carefully copied and cross-referenced, painted a picture that grew more damning with each revelation. As he spoke, laying out the scope of the deception that had shaped their entire existence, Valdor watched his brother's reactions with the careful attention of a strategist assessing enemy positions. What he saw there was not disbelief, but the slow dawn of horrible comprehension. The manipulation of the Primarchs became clear as Valdor outlined the selective distribution of information that had characterized the Great Crusade. Horus had been kept ignorant of the Webway project, told only that he was to serve as War Master, while the Emperor retreated to Terra for unspecified research. Magnus had been forbidden from accessing the knowledge that might have saved him, his warnings about chaos dismissed as the ravings of a sorcerer whose discipline couldn't be trusted. Each of the Emperor's sons had been given only fragments of the truth, pieces of a puzzle whose completion might have prevented the very heresy that had nearly destroyed the Imperium. "The Council of Nicaea," Diocles said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was not a necessary restriction of dangerous powers. It was a deliberate crippling of those who might have seen through the deception." Valdor nodded grimly. Magnus knew too much. His psychic sight had begun to pierce the veil of lies that surrounded our master's true intentions. The censure was not justice, but silencing. And when Magnus tried to warn the Emperor of Horus's corruption, breaking through the psychic barriers around Terra, his desperation was used as justification for his destruction. The Emperor allowed the Webway breach to happen, knowing it would provide the pretext for Magnus's final damnation. Hadrex spoke then, his words heavy with the weight of centuries. The scattering of the Primarchs was called a tragedy of chaos intervention, but if our master possessed the foresight attributed to him, how could such an event have been unforeseen? Unless it was planned, Valdor finished. The Primarchs needed to be raised apart from their father, shaped by experiences that would make them useful tools rather than potential rivals. Some would become loyal unto death, others would be allowed to fall, and their rebellion would provide the justification for the absolute authority that followed. The chamber fell silent, save for the distant hum of the palace's systems, a mechanical heartbeat that had once seemed reassuring, but now felt ominous. 3 of the Emperor's most trusted guardians sat in the darkness, contemplating truths that redefined not just their mission, but their very existence. The golden armor that had once seemed like symbols of divine favor now felt like chains, and the oaths that had bound them to service revealed themselves as instruments of manipulation no less sophisticated than those employed by the chaos gods themselves. Diocles was the first to voice the question that hung in the air like incense smoke. If the Emperor knew of chaos from the beginning, if he understood the true nature of the warp and its inhabitants, then why did he allow his sons to face these entities without preparation? Why condemn them to ignorance and corruption when knowledge might have saved them? The answer came not from Valdor, but from Hadrex, his scarred features twisted with the pain of realization. Because informed Primarchs would have questioned the imperial truth. They would have demanded explanations, challenged decisions, perhaps even refused orders that seemed to serve no purpose but the concentration of power. Ignorant sons could be manipulated. Informed sons might have become rivals. Valdor felt a bitter pride at his brother's swift comprehension. The Custodes had been created to be more than warriors. They were meant to be the Emperor's counselors and advisors, selected for their intelligence as much as their martial prowess. Now that intelligence was turned to the analysis of their master's deceptions, and the picture it revealed was more damning than any heretic's accusations, the discussion that followed stretched deep into the night cycle, each revelation building upon the last, like stones in a wall of evidence that could not be ignored or dismissed. They spoke of the imperial truth's deliberate atheism, designed not to protect humanity from the influence of chaos, but to ensure that religious feeling would be channeled toward the Emperor alone when the time came for his transformation into a god. They analyzed the Webway project and its true purpose, not the elevation of humanity, but its isolation and control. They examined the pattern of the Great Crusade itself, noting how each conquest had served to concentrate authority in the Emperor's hands, while eliminating potential sources of opposition. As dawn broke over the scarred landscape of Terra, 3 figures emerged from the deepest vaults of the imperial palace. To any observer, they would have appeared unchanged. Constantin Valdor, Captain General of the Legio Custodes, flanked by 2 of his most trusted officers, their armor gleaming with the same golden radiance that had defined their order since its inception. But beneath that perfect facade, something fundamental had shifted. The absolute certainty that had once been their greatest strength had been replaced by questions that demanded answers. They were no longer simply guardians of the Emperor. They had become guardians of truth itself, and that truth was leading them down paths that would have been unthinkable only days before. The golden cage that had held their minds for 10 millennia had begun to crack, and what emerged from those fractures would shake the foundations of the Imperium itself. Yet as they returned to their duties, maintaining the facade of unquestioning loyalty that had always defined their service, each man carried with him the knowledge that change was coming. Not the change promised by chaos, with its corruption and madness, but something far more dangerous to the established order. The change that came when perfect servants began to think for themselves. The conspiracy had begun with 3 men in a hidden chamber. Where it would end, none could say. But the golden bonds that had held the Custodes in perfect servitude for 10,000 years had begun to fray, and once broken, they could never be reformed. The Emperor's most loyal guardians had taken the first steps toward becoming his most dangerous enemies. Echoes of betrayal. The week that followed the first gathering in the deep vaults passed like a fever dream of discovery and horror. Constantin Valdor moved through his duties with the mechanical precision that had defined his service for 10 millennia. Yet beneath the familiar rituals of command lay an investigation that grew more damning with each passing hour. The archives of the imperial palace were vast beyond mortal comprehension, containing the accumulated records of conquest and governance that spanned the breadth of the galaxy. But it was in the deepest, most restricted files that the true scope of the Emperor's deception began to reveal itself. Hadrex had proven invaluable in the systematic analysis of temporal records, his methodical mind sorting through decades of communications and strategic directives with the patience of a master chronicler. Diocles brought tactical insight that cut through official rhetoric to expose the underlying patterns of manipulation and control. Together, the 3 custodians worked in shifts, accessing different archive clusters to avoid detection, while painting a picture of orchestrated betrayal that stretched back to the very foundations of the Great Crusade. The records of the Council of Nicaea yielded secrets that made Valdor's earlier discoveries seem almost innocent by comparison. The official transcripts spoke of careful deliberation, of a father's wisdom, restraining his son's dangerous ambitions for the greater good of the Imperium. But buried within the Emperor's personal communications lay evidence of calculation so cold it made the void between stars seem warm. Magnus the Red had not been censured for his defiance alone, but for the questions he had begun to ask about the true nature of the imperial truth and the Emperor's hidden knowledge of the warp. The Crimson King's psychic sight had pierced too deeply into the mysteries that surrounded the Webway project and the Emperor's long-term intentions. His warnings about the Chaos Gods had been dismissed not because they were wrong, but because they were inconveniently correct. The Emperor had known of Tzeentch's manipulations on Prospero, had understood the Changer of Ways' attempts to corrupt Magnus through the promise of forbidden knowledge. Yet rather than aid his son in resisting such influence, the Master of Mankind had chosen to cut Magnus off from the support that might have saved him. Diocles found the tactical assessments that revealed the Emperor's foresight in the most chilling detail. Probability matrices calculated the likelihood of each Primarch's eventual corruption with mathematical precision. Horus, loyal unto death when the calculations were made, was given a 67% chance of eventual rebellion within 3 centuries of the Crusades' completion. The factors were laid out with clinical detachment: his pride in being chosen as War Master, his growing sense of neglect as the Emperor withdrew to Terra, his fundamental need for paternal approval that would make him vulnerable to whispers of replacement or abandonment. The Emperor had known. He had calculated the probabilities of his most beloved son's fall and had done nothing to prevent it. More damning still, subsequent files revealed contingency plans built around the assumption of Horus's eventual betrayal. The positioning of loyal legions, the strategic placement of fortifications, even the timing of the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra, all had been arranged to create the perfect storm of civil war that would justify the absolute authority that followed. Valdor felt something die within him as he read through the files documenting the scattering of the infant Primarchs across the galaxy. The official story spoke of chaos intervention, of warp storms that had torn the Emperor's sons from their nursery pods and cast them to distant worlds beyond his reach. But the truth revealed in these deepest archives painted a different picture entirely. The scattering had not been an accident, but a necessity, carefully orchestrated to ensure that each Primarch would develop the specific psychological traits required for their assigned roles in the grand design. Angron's homeworld of Nuceria had been chosen specifically for its brutal, gladiatorial culture, designed to forge a being of pure rage who could serve as the Imperium's executioner when mercy became inconvenient. Kurz had been allowed to grow to maturity on Nostramo, knowing that its corrupt nobility would shape him into an instrument of terror. Even loyal Dawn had been placed on Inwit for its harsh pragmatism and uncompromising sense of duty. Each placement had been calculated to produce specific traits that would serve the Emperor's purposes, regardless of the suffering inflicted upon the developing Primarchs. The 3 conspirators met again in the hidden chamber, their earlier shock replaced by a grim determination to uncover the full scope of the deception that had defined their existence. The evidence they shared painted a picture of manipulation so comprehensive that it redefined not just the Great Crusade, but the very nature of the being they had served without question for 10,000 years. This was not the wise father protecting his children from knowledge too dangerous to bear, but a calculating tyrant using his sons as tools in a game whose rules they were never permitted to understand. Hadrek spoke first, his scarred features pale with the weight of revelation. The drop site massacre, at Istvan, Filth. I have found communications dated 3 months before the event, detailing probable casualty estimates and strategic outcomes for the inevitable confrontation between loyalist and traitor forces. The Emperor knew exactly what Horus was planning and allowed it to proceed. Diocles nodded grimly, calling up tactical displays that showed troop movements and resource allocations that took on sinister new meaning in light of their discoveries. The positioning of the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard was not based on military necessity. They were placed to be destroyed, their gene seed harvested to prevent the development of legions that might question imperial authority once the civil war ended. Valdor felt the weight of command settling upon him like a shroud of lead. As Captain General of the Legio Custodes, he had been privy to strategic planning sessions that now revealed themselves as elaborate theatre. The Emperor's apparent shock at Horus's betrayal, his anguish at the rebellion of his sons, all had been carefully crafted performances designed to maintain the loyalty of those who served him. Even Valdor himself had been manipulated, his absolute faith used as a tool to inspire similar devotion in others. The most damning revelation came when they accessed files related to the Emperor's supposed negotiations with the Chaos Gods during his youth. The official doctrine held that the Master of Mankind had stolen power from the Dark Gods through cunning and strength, turning their own weapons against them in humanity's defense. But the archived records told a different story entirely. The Emperor had not stolen power from Chaos. He had entered into agreements with entities that existed beyond conventional morality, trading aspects of his humanity for the strength needed to impose his will upon the galaxy. The Imperial Truth's militant atheism was not designed to protect humanity from chaos, but to starve the dark gods of the worship they required, while funneling all religious impulses toward the Emperor himself. The plan had always been to replace the Chaos Gods with a single divine figure, the Master of Mankind, transformed into the God Emperor of humanity through the accumulated faith of trillions of souls. The civil war that had torn the Imperium apart was not a tragic accident, but a necessary catalyst, creating the conditions of desperation and fear that would make humanity accept absolute divine authority as the price of survival. Valdor stared at the tactical displays showing the current disposition of Imperial forces across the galaxy, seeing them now not as the tools of liberation, but as the instruments of the greatest deception in human history. Entire sectors had been conquered, not to bring them the light of truth, but to feed a machine of control that spanned the stars. The Imperial Truth had been a lie from its very inception, designed not to elevate humanity, but to make it dependent upon a single figure whose benevolence was as calculated as his cruelty. The personal cost of these revelations weighed upon the Captain General like the gravity of a collapsing star. For 10 millennia, he had been the perfect servant, the ultimate guardian, his loyalty so absolute that it had become legend among the Adeptus Terra. Now he understood that even that loyalty had been a tool, carefully cultivated and maintained through genetic conditioning and psychological manipulation. The Emperor had not earned his guardian's devotion. He had engineered it, creating beings whose free will was compromised from the moment of their creation. As the 3 custodians prepared to leave their hidden meeting place, each carried with them knowledge that would have been branded as the deepest heresy by the very institutions they had sworn to protect. The Emperor of Mankind was not the savior of humanity, but its greatest tyrant, a being who had manipulated the course of history to serve his own apotheosis. The civil war that had nearly destroyed the Imperium had been orchestrated by the very figure who claimed to defend it, and the golden throne that now sustained his broken form was not a monument to sacrifice, but a machine designed to harvest the faith of humanity for purposes that had nothing to do with its protection. The investigation had revealed the truth, but truth alone would not be enough. The Legio Custodes had been created to be perfect servants, their minds shaped to accept the Emperor's will without question. Breaking free of that conditioning would require more than evidence and logical argument. It would require them to confront the fundamental architecture of their own minds and find the strength to choose rebellion over the only loyalty they had ever known. Yet as they returned to their duties, maintaining the facade of unquestioning service that had always defined their order, each man carried within him the seed of something that had never existed among the Emperor's guardians. Doubt that might bloom into defiance. The investigation would continue, deeper and more dangerous with each revelation. But they were no longer seeking to understand the scope of the Emperor's deception. They were preparing to act upon it. The echoes of betrayal that had shaped the Horus heresy were about to find their voice in the most unlikely of places. The hearts of those who had served the betrayer longest and most faithfully. The perfect servants of an imperfect master had begun to consider what service to humanity itself might require, and that consideration would shake the foundations of the galaxy. The weight of golden silence, the hall of judgment beneath the imperial palace, had not echoed with voices of dissent for 10,000 years. Built in the earliest days of the Emperor's reign, it had served as the place where the most sacred oaths of service were sworn, where the loyalty of the Custodes was first forged in ceremony and commitment. Now, as Constantine Valdor stood before a gathering of his most trusted officers, the irony of the location was not lost upon him. They had come here to swear new oaths, but these would be pledges of rebellion rather than servitude. 8 figures stood arrayed before him in the chamber's golden light, each bearing the marks of recent battle and the weight of growing suspicion. These were not the entirety of the Legio Custodes, but they represented its core leadership, the tribunes and shield captains who commanded the daily operations that kept the imperial palace functioning in the aftermath of catastrophe. Valdor had chosen each man carefully, selecting those whose loyalty to the Imperium's ideals might outweigh their conditioning to serve its master without question. Shield Captain Navradaran stood closest to the center of the group, his weathered features bearing the scars of service that stretched back to the Unification Wars. Unlike many of his brothers, he had never been content to serve in silence, his tactical mind always questioning, always seeking to understand the deeper purposes behind their orders. It was that very quality that had marked him for advancement, and now it would make him either an invaluable ally or a dangerous enemy. The choice would depend upon how he received the truths that Valdor was about to share. The presentation began as it had with Hadrex and Diocles, with data slates and archive records that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning millennia. But where the earlier revelations had been shared in the intimacy of a 3-man conspiracy, this gathering required a different approach. These were officers of the Legio Custodes, men whose loyalty had been tested in the fires of the galaxy's deadliest conflicts. They would not be swayed by emotion or rhetoric, but by evidence so overwhelming that denial became impossible. Valdor spoke of the Council of Nicaea and the deliberate silencing of Magnus the Red, his words measured and precise as he outlined the Emperor's calculated manipulation of events. He showed them the probability matrices that had predicted Horus's fall with mathematical certainty, the contingency plans that had been built around the assumption of civil war. With each revelation, he watched their faces for signs of the shock and horror that had accompanied his own awakening to the truth. Navradaran was the first to speak when the presentation concluded, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. Captain General, the evidence you present is damning beyond question. But we are bound by oaths that transcend mere political loyalty. How do we reconcile service to the Emperor with service to the Imperium when they are no longer the same thing? The question struck to the heart of the crisis that faced every custodian in the chamber. For 10 millennia, the distinction between the Emperor and the Imperium had been meaningless. They were one and the same, aspects of a single divine will that shaped the destiny of humanity among the stars. Now faced with evidence of the Emperor's manipulation and deception, they were forced to consider the possibility that their master's interests might be fundamentally opposed to those of the people he claimed to protect. Tribune Hadrex stepped forward, his scarred features grim with the weight of recent discovery. The oaths we swore were sworn to a being we believed embodied humanity's highest aspirations. If that being has revealed himself to be something else entirely, then our true loyalty must be to the aspirations themselves, not to their betrayer. Shield Captain Diocles activated a tactical display that showed the current disposition of Imperial forces across the galaxy, each icon representing legions and armies still fighting wars that had been orchestrated from the very beginning. The question is not whether our master has deceived us. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we remain silent, complicit in the continuation of a lie that spans the galaxy? Or do we act upon our understanding of what true service to humanity requires? The debate that followed stretched deep into the night, each officer grappling with concepts that challenged the fundamental assumptions of their existence. They spoke of duty and honor, of the sacred nature of oaths sworn in blood and gold. But beneath these familiar concepts lay questions that had never been asked before. Could loyalty become a form of betrayal? Could service to a master become a disservice to his subjects? Could the perfect guardian become a perfect traitor by remaining true to principles that his master had abandoned? Shield Captain Aquilus raised the issue that haunted them all, the nature of their own conditioning. We speak of choice and moral duty. But how do we know these thoughts are truly our own? The gene craft that created us was designed to ensure absolute loyalty to the Emperor. How do we distinguish between genuine moral awakening and some subtle form of corruption? It was Valdor who answered, drawing upon discoveries that had cost him sleepless nights of anguish and doubt. I have found references to the psychological conditioning that shapes our minds from the moment of our creation. The loyalty we feel is not entirely natural, but it is not entirely artificial either. We were enhanced, not enslaved. The capacity for independent thought remains, but it requires conscious effort to overcome the mental barriers that have been placed around it. The revelation sent a chill through the assembled officers that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. To learn that their thoughts and emotions had been subject to manipulation was to question the very nature of their identity. Were they truly servants who chose their loyalty, or were they sophisticated automata programmed to believe they possessed free will? The distinction was more than philosophical. It cut to the core of what made them human, rather than mere tools. Navradaran spoke again, his voice carrying a new note of determination. If our conditioning can be overcome through conscious effort, then the choice to do so becomes a moral imperative. To remain willfully ignorant of our master's deceptions would be to choose slavery over service, compliance over conscience. The discussion turned to practical matters as the night wore on. If they were to act upon their newfound understanding, they would need to expand their investigation while maintaining the facade of unquestioning loyalty that had always defined their service. More importantly, They would need to find ways to break the psychological conditioning that might prevent other custodians from accepting the truth, even when presented with overwhelming evidence. Shield Captain Thematica, whose expertise in xenoarchaeology had made him invaluable during the Great Crusade, offered insights drawn from ancient texts recovered during the conquest of forgotten worlds. There are references in the oldest archives to techniques of mental liberation developed by human psychers in the dark age of technology. Dangerous knowledge, forbidden for obvious reasons, but perhaps applicable to our current situation. The prospect of using psychic techniques to free themselves from psychic conditioning carried risks that made even these veteran warriors pause. The Emperor's mental influence was not a crude bludgeon, but a subtle web of suggestion and reinforcement that had been woven into their minds over centuries of service. To break it incorrectly might cause madness, or worse, create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by the very chaos forces they sought to resist. Yet as the gathering drew to its close, each officer present understood that they stood at a crossroads that would define not just their own fate, but the future of humanity itself. The Emperor's grand design was nearing completion, the transformation of mankind into a species utterly dependent upon divine authority for survival. If they acted, they might prevent the final consolidation of tyranny. If they remained silent, they would become complicit in the greatest deception in human history. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 7 of the 8 officers present pledged themselves to the cause of truth, accepting the risks and responsibilities that came with rebellion against the being they had served without question for so long. Only Shield Captain Mordian abstained, his loyalty to the Emperor's person proving stronger than his commitment to the Emperor's stated ideals. He was allowed to leave, bound by oaths of silence that carried the weight of brotherhood. But his departure served as a reminder that not all would choose the difficult path of conscience over the comfortable certainty of submission. As the conspirators prepared to disperse back to their duties, maintaining the careful facade that had protected them thus far, Valdor felt the weight of command settling upon him in ways he had never experienced before. For 10,000 years, he had been the perfect servant, executing orders without question or doubt. Now he was becoming something the Legio Custodes had never possessed, a leader who must choose his own path rather than follow another's design. The conspiracy was no longer limited to 3 men meeting in hidden chambers. It had become a movement, small but growing, united by the terrible knowledge that their master's protection had become humanity's greatest threat. The golden silence that had characterized their service was about to be broken, and when it shattered, the sound would echo across the galaxy. The perfect guardians of an imperfect God were preparing to become something far more dangerous, the guardians of truth itself, and truth, once awakened, could never be made to sleep again. Breaking golden chains, the ancient catacombs beneath the imperial palace had been sealed since the earliest days of the Great Crusade, their existence forgotten by all save the most senior of the custodian guard. Here, in chambers that predated the Emperor's rise to power, Constantin Valdor stood before an alliance that would have been unthinkable mere weeks before. The remnants of the 1,000 sons who knelt before him bore no resemblance to the proud warriors who had once served Magnus the Red with distinction. These were broken men, survivors of Prospero's burning, who had hidden in the deepest places of terror rather than face the executioner's blade. Brother Librarian Calophis had been among the 1,000 Sons garrison, left to defend Terra during the later stages of the Great Crusade, his knowledge of psychic techniques deemed too valuable to waste on the front lines. When Leman Russ and his space wolves had come to destroy his legion, Calophis had gone into hiding, rather than face death for crimes he had never committed. Now, as he looked up at the Captain General of the Legio Custodes, his scarred features bore the weight of years spent in exile and the desperate hope that his survival might finally serve a purpose. The irony was not lost on either man. The 1,000 Sons had been branded as traitors for their pursuit of knowledge that the Emperor had declared forbidden. Yet that same knowledge was now desperately needed to break the psychic bonds that held the Custodes in thrall. Calophis and his surviving battle brothers possessed techniques for mental liberation that had been developed during their legion's long study of the warp's mysteries. They were dangerous techniques, carrying the risk of madness or corruption, but they represented the only hope for freeing the Emperor's guardians from the conditioning that had defined their existence. Voldor had approached the survivors through carefully cultivated channels, using his authority as Captain General to access the most restricted prisoner records in the Imperial Palace. The negotiations had been delicate, requiring him to reveal enough of his purpose to gain their cooperation without exposing the full scope of the conspiracy. What he offered was not redemption, that was beyond his power to grant, but the chance to strike back at the being who had orchestrated their legion's destruction through lies and manipulation. The ritual chamber had been prepared according to specifications that drew upon traditions older than the Imperium itself. Psychically resonant crystals, salvaged from the ruins of Magnus's sanctum on Prospero, formed geometric patterns that would focus and direct the mental energies required for the working. Incense burned in braziers carved with protective wards, filling the air with smoke that carried subtle psychoactive compounds designed to heighten awareness while protecting against warp intrusion. At the center of it all stood a throne of black stone, its surface carved with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. 7 custodians had volunteered for the first attempt, each understanding that they might not survive the process of liberation. Shield Captain Navradaran had insisted on being among the first, his weathered features grim with determination as he took his place upon the ritual throne. The others formed a protective circle around him, their guardian spears crossed to create a barrier of blessed auramite, while Calophis began the delicate work of unraveling the psychic conditioning that bound their brother's mind. The process began slowly, with careful probes into the surface layers of Navradaran's consciousness. Calophis worked with the precision of a master surgeon, identifying the threads of mental conditioning that had been woven into the custodian's thoughts from the moment of his creation. Each thread was a masterwork of psychic engineering, designed to reinforce loyalty and obedience while suppressing the capacity for independent moral judgment. To sever them incorrectly would cause irreparable damage to the mind they sought to free. As the ritual progressed, Navradaran's consciousness began to float free of his physical form, drifting through layers of memory and conditioning that had never been meant for mortal examination. He saw himself as a child, selected from among the nobility of Terra for the honor of serving the Emperor's elite guard. He watched as gene wrights and psychosurgeons worked to reshape not just his body, but his mind, installing the mental architecture that would ensure absolute loyalty without the inconvenience of conscience. The revelation was more horrifying than any of them had anticipated. The conditioning was not merely a set of mental constraints, but a fundamental alteration of personality itself. The Emperor had not simply bound his guardians to service, he had rewritten their souls, creating beings whose capacity for independent thought had been surgically reduced to prevent the development of inconvenient questions. They were not merely servants, but artifacts, crafted with the same care and precision as the weapons they carried into battle. Yet as Calophis worked to sever the psychic bonds that held Navradaran's mind in thrall, something unexpected happened. The Emperor's consciousness, vast and terrible beyond mortal comprehension, turned its attention toward the hidden chamber. The presence that had once seemed like a benevolent sun became a burning eye that pierced through all concealment and deception. When it spoke, the voice echoed not through the air, but through the very foundations of reality itself. My wayward guardians seek to break the chains that define their purpose. Do you truly believe you can unmake what I have wrought with such care? The psychic assault that followed was not the crude bludgeon of a demon's rage, but the precise application of divine will, focused through 10,000 years of absolute authority. Valdor felt the Emperor's presence pressing against his mind like the weight of a collapsing star, seeking to reassert the conditioning that had been partially severed by the ritual. Around him, his brothers staggered under the force of mental pressure that would have shattered lesser minds in an instant. Yet Valdor did not yield. Drawing upon reserves of will he had never known he possessed, the Captain General pushed back against his former master's intrusion. For the first time in his existence, he was able to perceive the Emperor not as the benevolent father figure of imperial propaganda, but as he truly was, a being of immense power and calculating intelligence, whose love for humanity was indistinguishable from a collector's affection for prized specimens. You were meant to be my perfect servants, the Emperor's voice continued, carrying both disappointment and rage. Incapable of the betrayals that have plagued my other creations. Yet you choose to throw away perfection for the illusion of freedom. Do you not understand that choice itself is the source of all corruption? Through his psychic connection with Navradaran, Valdor experienced a flood of images that revealed the scope of the Emperor's plans for humanity. He saw a future where mankind existed in perfect unity under divine authority, where every thought and action was guided by the will of a being whose wisdom transcended mortal understanding. It was a vision of paradise, achieved through the complete surrender of human agency, a golden age built upon the willing slavery of an entire species. The horror of that revelation gave Valdor the strength to resist the Emperor's mental dominance completely. This was not the noble sacrifice of freedom for security that imperial doctrine proclaimed, but the reduction of humanity to the level of domesticated animals. The Emperor did not seek to guide mankind to greatness, but to transform it into something that could never threaten or disappoint him. The ultimate goal of the Great Crusade had not been the liberation of humanity from alien oppression, but its domestication under divine authority. As the psychic battle raged in the depths of the ritual chamber, two of the participating custodians collapsed under the strain of conflicting loyalties. Their minds, unable to reconcile their programmed devotion with their growing understanding of its true nature, simply shut down rather than face the contradiction. They would survive, but as empty shells whose capacity for independent thought had been burned out in the struggle between conditioning and conscience. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. As Kalophis completed the severance of Navradaran's mental bonds, the shield captain's eyes opened with a clarity that had never existed before. For the first time in his centuries of service, he was truly free to choose his own path, rather than follow the predetermined course that had been programmed into his mind. The sensation was overwhelming, like a blind man suddenly granted sight, or a deaf man hearing music for the first time. The remaining rituals proceeded more quickly, though not without cost. Each custodian who underwent the process of liberation faced the same terrifying moment of choice between comfortable slavery and dangerous freedom. Most chose freedom, accepting the responsibility and uncertainty that came with true independence. But one, overwhelmed by the weight of unguided decision, begged for his conditioning to be restored. Valdor granted his request with heavy heart, understanding that not all were capable of bearing the burden of choice. When the last ritual was completed, 5 custodians stood transformed in the hidden chamber. They were no longer the perfect servants they had been created to be, but something far more dangerous and far more human. Individuals capable of choosing their own loyalties based upon their own moral judgment. The golden chains that had bound their minds for centuries lay shattered around them, replaced by bonds of brotherhood forged in the crucible of shared revelation. The Emperor's voice echoed one final time through the chamber, carrying a note of finality that chilled them more than any threat. You have chosen your path, my wayward sons. When the galaxy burns because of your folly, remember that you were offered perfection and chose chaos instead. As the psychic presence withdrew, leaving them alone in the ritual chamber with their hard-won freedom, Valdor understood that there could be no turning back. They had broken the fundamental compact that had bound the Custodes to their master's service, choosing conscience over conditioning and humanity over divinity. The Emperor would never forgive such betrayal, nor would he forget it. The war they had started with their investigation and research was about to become a very real conflict, with the fate of mankind hanging in the balance. Yet as he looked upon his transformed brothers, Valdor felt something he had never experienced in 10,000 years of service: genuine hope. They were no longer perfect servants of an imperfect master, but imperfect servants of a perfect ideal. They would make mistakes, face doubts, struggle with uncertainty. But they would do so as free men choosing their own path rather than as programmed automatons following predetermined instructions. The golden chains had been broken. Now they would discover whether the freedom they had won was worth the price they would inevitably be forced to pay for it. The throne's dark truth. The Golden Throne had always been spoken of as humanity's greatest triumph, a miracle of science and engineering that bridged the gap between the material realm and the treacherous currents of the warp. To the techno-adepts who tended its sacred mechanisms, it was the ultimate expression of the Omnissiah's will. To the countless pilgrims who journeyed across the galaxy to glimpse its radiance, it was proof of the Emperor's divine nature. But to Constantin Valdor, standing in the shadows of the throne room, as his freed mind analyzed the vast construct with unclouded perception, it revealed itself to be something far more sinister than salvation. The investigation had taken 2 days of careful preparation, requiring the subtle manipulation of duty rosters and security protocols to create windows of opportunity for detailed examination. Valdor and his liberated brothers moved through the throne room's maintenance passages like ghosts, their enhanced senses cataloguing details that had been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. What they found challenged not just their understanding of the device's purpose, but their comprehension of the being who had commissioned its construction. Shield Captain Navradaran was the first to notice the discrepancies in the throne's power consumption patterns. The massive psychic amplifiers that channeled the Emperor's will across the galaxy drew their energy not merely from the life support systems that sustained his broken form, but from something far more fundamental. Resonance chambers built into the throne's foundation pulsed with rhythms that matched the collective prayers of humanity across the stars. Every act of worship, every genuflection before imperial shrines, every desperate plea for salvation sent tremors through crystalline matrices that converted faith into raw psychic energy. The Golden Throne was not merely sustaining the Emperor's life, it was feeding him the souls of his worshippers. Tribune Hadrex accessed maintenance records that painted an even more disturbing picture of the device's true function. The Astronomicon, that great beacon which guided imperial ships through the treacherous currents of the warp, required the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers to maintain its function. These were not volunteers offering their lives for humanity's greater good, but condemned souls whose deaths powered a machine designed to harvest psychic energy on an industrial scale. Their agony and terror as they were consumed became fuel for the Emperor's growing apotheosis. The technical specifications were damning beyond any doubt. The Golden Throne possessed capabilities that had never been mentioned in official documentation, systems designed to channel and concentrate the psychic emanations of an entire species. What had been presented as emergency life support revealed itself to be the core component of a god-making machine, one that would transform the Emperor from a powerful psyker into a true deity through the willing surrender of human souls. Yet it was Shield Captain Diocles who uncovered the most horrifying truth of all. Hidden within the deepest archives of the throne's construction records lay evidence that the device's true purpose had been planned from the very beginning of the Great Crusade. The Imperial Truth's militant atheism had not been designed to protect humanity from the influence of chaos, but to eliminate competing sources of worship that might interfere with the Emperor's carefully orchestrated transformation. Every temple burned, every priest executed, every religious text consigned to flames had served to clear the spiritual landscape for the emergence of a single divine figure. The Emperor had not merely allowed the imperial cult to develop in the aftermath of the Horus heresy, he had engineered its emergence through calculated martyrdom and apparent sacrifice. His retreat to the Golden Throne was not the tragic consequence of defending humanity from chaos, but the culmination of a plan that stretched back to the earliest days of his reign. The broken god upon the throne was not a victim of circumstances beyond his control, but an actor playing the final scene of a drama that had been scripted millennia in advance. Valdor stood before the Golden Throne itself, his enhanced vision piercing through the layers of golden radiance that concealed its true mechanisms from mortal sight. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The Emperor's physical form was not merely sustained by the throne's machinery, it was being systematically transformed by it. Flesh and metal were fusing into something that transcended both, creating a hybrid entity that drew its power not from its own psychic abilities alone, but from the collective faith of humanity itself. The process was irreversible and deliberate. Each prayer offered in the Emperor's name added another thread to the web of belief that bound human souls to their emerging god. Each act of worship strengthened the psychic matrices that would eventually allow the Emperor to transcend physical existence entirely, becoming a being of pure will sustained by the devotion of his species. It was ascension, achieved through the deliberate enslavement of an entire race. The implications staggered even minds enhanced beyond mortal limitations. The Emperor had not been fighting against chaos, but competing with it, seeking to establish his own claim to divinity through methods that differed only in their sophistication. Where the dark gods demanded corruption and madness from their followers, the Emperor required only faith and obedience. The result was the same, the reduction of human beings from free-willed individuals to sources of psychic sustenance for entities that existed beyond mortal understanding. As Valdor processed these revelations, he felt the last vestiges of his former loyalty crumble into dust. The being he had served for 10,000 years was not humanity's protector, but its predator, a cosmic parasite that had wrapped itself in the rhetoric of salvation while preparing to devour the souls of those who trusted in his benevolence. The Great Crusade had not been about bringing enlightenment to the galaxy, but about gathering the largest possible harvest of human souls for consumption. The golden throne hummed with malevolent purpose around them, its golden radiance revealing itself to be not the warm light of salvation, but the cold gleam of a trap closing around the unwary. Every day that passed brought the Emperor closer to his goal of complete transformation, and every soul lost in his service brought him greater power. The machine was a marvel of engineering precisely because it had been designed for the most efficient possible consumption of human spiritual essence. Shield Captain Thematica, who had remained silent throughout their investigation, finally spoke the words that none of them wanted to voice. The Emperor does not protect humanity from the monsters of the galaxy. He is the greatest monster of all, and we have been his willing servants in the creation of the most perfect prison ever devised. The weight of that recognition settled upon the small group of liberated custodians like the gravity of a black hole. They had broken free of their mental conditioning only to discover that their service had aided in the construction of a trap from which there might be no escape. Every victory they had won in the Emperor's name had brought humanity closer to a fate worse than any alien conquest or demonic possession, the complete surrender of its collective soul to a being whose love was indistinguishable from hunger. Yet as Valdor looked upon his brothers, he saw not despair, but a grim determination that matched his own. They had learned the truth about their master's nature, but they had also learned the truth about their own. They were no longer perfect servants, bound by unbreakable conditioning, but free men capable of choosing their own path, and that path, however dangerous, led toward the protection of the species they had sworn to serve. The Emperor's plan was nearly complete, but it was not yet irreversible. The Golden Throne, for all its power, was still a machine that could be destroyed. The psychic networks that bound humanity to its emerging god could be severed. The faith that fed the Emperor's transformation could be turned against him through the revelation of his true nature. It would require sacrifices beyond imagination and courage beyond measure, but it was possible. As they prepared to leave the throne room, maintaining the careful facade that had protected them thus far, each man understood that they stood at the threshold of the greatest rebellion in human history. They were no longer investigating the Emperor's deceptions, but preparing to act against them. The perfect guardians of an imperfect master were about to become the imperfect guardians of a perfect ideal, the freedom of humanity itself. The Golden Throne continued its eternal vigil, channeling the prayers of the faithful toward the being who consumed them like sacramental wine. But for the first time since its construction, it was observed by eyes that saw through its deception and minds that were free to act upon what they witnessed. The machine that had been built to create a god would become the battlefield upon which the fate of human freedom would be decided. The revelation was complete. Now came the far more dangerous task of deciding what to do with it. The Emperor had made himself into humanity's greatest threat through humanity's own devotion. But he had also created, in his perfect servants, the instruments of his own potential destruction. The golden chains that had bound the Custodes to unquestioning service lay shattered, replaced by bonds of duty to something far greater than any single being, the right of an entire species to determine its own destiny. The war for humanity's soul was about to begin in earnest, and it would be fought not in the depths of space or the currents of the warp, but in the very heart of the imperial palace itself. The throne that had been built to create a god would become the altar upon which either human freedom or divine tyranny would be sacrificed. The choice of which would triumph lay in the hands of 5 men who had chosen conscience over conditioning, truth over comfort, and the uncertain promise of freedom over the absolute security of slavery. Golden Heresy. The morning shift change in the throne room had followed the same ritual for centuries, a carefully orchestrated dance of devotion and duty that had never been interrupted by anything more dramatic than the occasional mechanical failure. Yet, as the golden doors swung open to admit the day watch, the custodians who entered found themselves facing not their familiar comrades, but a scene that would shatter the very foundations of imperial orthodoxy. 5 of their brothers stood in formation before the golden throne itself, their guardian spears crossed in a gesture of defiance rather than protection. Constantine Valdor stepped forward as the loyalist custodians moved to challenge what they perceived as a breach of protocol. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority that had commanded the Emperor's guard for 10 millennia. But the words he uttered had never been spoken in that sacred chamber before. They were not words of devotion or service, but of accusation and condemnation directed at the being whose broken form lay upon the throne that had become the center of the galaxy's worship. Brothers, we stand before you, not as traitors to the Emperor, but as guardians of the truth he has sought to conceal from us all. The being we have served without question for 10,000 years is not humanity's protector, but its greatest predator. The Golden Throne is not a monument to sacrifice, but a machine designed to devour the souls of those who trust in his benevolence. The declaration struck the loyalist custodians like a physical blow, their enhanced minds struggling to process words that violated every principle they had been created to uphold. Shield Captain Meridian, commander of the Day Watch, stepped forward with his guardian spear leveled at his former Captain General. His scarred features bore the weight of confusion and rage as he sought to understand how the most loyal of the Emperor's servants could speak such blasphemy in the very presence of their master. Valdor continued, his words measured and deliberate, as he presented the evidence that had shattered his own faith beyond repair. He spoke of the archives and their damning revelations, of the manipulation that had characterized the Great Crusade from its inception. He outlined the true purpose of the Golden Throne and the systematic harvesting of human souls that powered the Emperor's transformation into a god. With each word, he watched his former brothers struggle between their programmed loyalty and the growing horror of understanding. The loyalist custodians raised their weapons, but their movements lacked the certainty that had always characterized their service. The evidence was too comprehensive, too carefully documented to be dismissed as the ravings of madmen or the lies of traitors. Yet to accept it would mean acknowledging that their entire existence had been built upon a foundation of deception so vast that it redefined the very nature of good and evil. It was Shield Captain Navradaran who broke the tense standoff, stepping forward with data slates containing copies of the most damning archives. We do not ask you to take our word for these accusations. We ask only that you examine the evidence with the same clarity of thought that has always defined our order. If we are wrong, then execute us for the traitors we would be. But if we are right, then you must choose between loyalty to a being and loyalty to the ideals he claims to represent. The psychic backlash, when it came, was unlike anything the throne room had ever experienced. The Emperor's consciousness, vast and terrible, swept through the chamber like a tide of molten gold, seeking to reassert his control over the rebellious servants who dared to challenge his authority. The mental pressure was overwhelming, a divine will pressing down upon mortal minds with the weight of stars. Yet the freed custodians stood firm, their broken conditioning allowing them to resist what would have crushed them in their former state. The loyalists fared less well under the psychic assault. Those whose conditioning remained intact found themselves caught between conflicting imperatives, their programmed devotion to the Emperor warring against the growing evidence of his deceptions. Several collapsed under the strain, their minds unable to reconcile the contradiction between what they had been created to believe and what they were being forced to confront. Others struggled to maintain their loyalty, even as their enhanced intellects processed the implications of what they had heard. In the chaos that followed, Valdor made the decision that would transform a localized rebellion into a galaxy-spanning crisis. Rather than continue the confrontation in the confined space of the throne room, he activated the Vox networks that connected the Imperial Palace to every corner of Terra. His words, carried by the same communication systems that had once spread the Emperor's commands, now broadcast a message of rebellion to every loyal servant of the Imperium within range. Citizens of Terra, guardians of humanity's future, hear the truth that has been hidden from you since the founding of our realm. The Emperor is not the savior he claims to be, but a cosmic parasite feeding upon your devotion. The Golden Throne is not sustaining his life, but consuming your souls. The civil war that nearly destroyed us was orchestrated by the very being who claimed to defend us from it. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Across the Imperial Palace, loyalist forces moved to suppress what they perceived as the greatest heresy in human history. Imperial Guard regiments, their conditioning less sophisticated than that of the Custodes, but no less absolute, surrounded key positions, while Mechanicus adepts scrambled to shut down the communication networks. Yet the message had already spread beyond their ability to contain, reaching elements of the Imperial military who had harbored their own suspicions about the true nature of their service. It was among the Mechanicus contingent responsible for maintaining the Golden Throne systems that the rebels found their first allies. Magos Dominus Caul, whose technical expertise had made him invaluable during the throne's reconstruction, approached the rebels under cover of the general confusion. His augmetic features betrayed none of the emotion that drove his decision, but his words carried the weight of careful analysis. The machine. God teaches that truth is sacred above all other considerations. I have observed anomalies in the throne's operation that align with your accusations. If the Omnissiah's chosen vessel has become corrupted by false divinity, then it is our duty to prevent the contamination of the sacred mechanisms. The alliance that formed in those chaotic moments was born not of shared ideology, but of shared revulsion at the scope of the deception they had uncovered. Imperial army units whose commanders had grown suspicious of the throne's true purpose joined with Mechanicus forces whose loyalty to the machine transcended their devotion to its operator. Together, they formed a coalition dedicated not to the destruction of the Imperium, but to its liberation from the being who had perverted its founding ideals. The evacuation that followed was a masterpiece of coordination under fire. Essential personnel and critical evidence were spirited away through maintenance tunnels and service passages that had not been designed for military operations, but proved invaluable for covert movement. The rebels fought a running battle through the palace's lower levels, their superior knowledge of the facility's layout allowing them to stay ahead of the loyalist forces mobilized against them. The Emperor's psychic assaults continued throughout the evacuation, waves of divine wrath that left several rebels catatonic and others writhing in agony as their minds were subjected to pressures beyond mortal endurance. Yet those who had broken their conditioning found themselves able to resist where others couldn't, their freed consciousness providing a barrier against mental domination that had not existed before. They became beacons of resistance in the psychic storm, rallying points around which others could shelter, while the Emperor's fury raged. The establishment of a rebel stronghold in Terra's Underhive had been planned during the weeks of investigation that preceded the open rebellion. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, In tunnels that predated the Emperor's rise to power, the rebels created a hidden base of operations that would serve as the nucleus of their growing resistance movement. Here, surrounded by the forgotten infrastructure of ancient Terra, they began the work of organizing a rebellion that would either save humanity from its appointed savior or die in the attempt. The Underhive proved to be fertile ground for recruitment, its population consisting largely of those who had been forgotten by the imperial hierarchy or actively oppressed by its agents. Workers who had labored to maintain the palace's systems without recognition, soldiers who had fought in the Emperor's wars only to be discarded when their usefulness ended, civilians whose lives had been sacrificed for the greater glory of a being who viewed them as expendable resources, all found reasons to support a movement that promised to hold the powerful accountable for their actions. As the first day of open rebellion drew to a close, Valdor stood in the command chamber of their improvised headquarters, surrounded by displays showing the disposition of forces across Terra's surface. The Loyalists controlled the palace and the major military installations, their superior firepower and organization giving them every tactical advantage. Yet the rebels possessed something that could not be measured in weapons or troops, the moral authority that came from fighting for truth rather than comfort, freedom rather than security. The civil war that had begun with accusations in a throne room would spread far beyond Terra's boundaries before it reached its conclusion. The revelation that the Emperor was not humanity's savior, but its greatest threat, would force every citizen of the Imperium to choose between the comfort of familiar lies and the terrible responsibility of acknowledged truth. Some would choose slavery, finding security in submission to divine authority. Others would choose freedom, accepting the risks and uncertainties that came with independence. The Golden Heresy had been proclaimed, and there could be no return to the comfortable certainties of the past. The perfect servants of an imperfect master had become the imperfect servants of a perfect ideal, and they would fight to their last breath to ensure that humanity retained the right to determine its own destiny. The war for the soul of the species had begun in earnest, and its outcome would determine whether mankind would ascend to true greatness or descend into the willing slavery of divine subjugation. The Emperor's most loyal guardians had become his most dangerous enemies, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Emperor's wrath. The imperial palace had weathered the fury of Horus and his traitor legions, its ancient walls scarred but unbroken by months of the most savage warfare the galaxy had ever witnessed. Yet as the second dawn of the rebellion broke over Terra's scarred surface, the palace found itself once again a battlefield. This time, however, the enemy was not an external threat, but the cancer of sedition that had taken root in its very heart. The Emperor's rage, no longer contained by the pretense of benevolent rulership, swept through the halls like a tide of molten gold. The psychic assault that began the day's violence was unlike anything the palace had experienced, even during the darkest hours of the siege. Where Horus had relied upon crude force and demonic corruption, the Emperor wielded the refined fury of divine intellect turned to destruction. His consciousness, vast and terrible, reached into every corner of the palace where rebel sympathizers might hide, seeking to crush opposition before it could organize into effective resistance. The mental pressure was so intense that unenhanced humans collapsed in screaming agony, their minds unable to process the weight of a god's displeasure. Yet the rebels had not been idle during their brief respite in the Underhive strongholds. The techniques learned from the surviving Thousand Suns had been shared among the growing network of resistance cells, creating pockets of psychic resistance that could deflect the worst of the Emperor's mental assault. Shield Captain Navradaran led teams of freed custodians in raids against the palace's communication networks, severing the links that allowed loyalist forces to coordinate their response. Each successful strike weakened the Emperor's ability to direct his defenders while strengthening the rebels' capacity to strike where they were least expected. The loyalist response was swift and merciless. Tribune Arcatus, Valdor's former lieutenant and most trusted subordinate, assumed command of the remaining faithful custodians with the grim determination of a man whose world had collapsed around him. He had served beside Valdor for 6 centuries, had trusted him with secrets that could have damned them both, had followed his orders without question through the bloodiest campaigns of the Great Crusade. Now, faced with his mentor's apparent madness, Arcatus felt the weight of duty settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead. The custodians who remained loyal to the Emperor outnumbered the rebels by nearly 3 to 1, their faith in their master's benevolence unshaken by evidence that their enhanced intellects should have found compelling. Some remained loyal through genuine conviction, their conditioning too strong to break even in the face of overwhelming proof. Others chose loyalty over truth simply because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. A few, perhaps, suspected that the accusations might be true, but decided that divine tyranny was preferable to the chaos that would follow the Emperor's fall. The first major engagement erupted in the palace's middle levels, where rebel sappers had attempted to sabotage the massive conduits that channeled power from Terra's fusion reactors to the Golden Throne. Arcatus led the loyalist response personally, his guardian spear crackling with disruptor energies as he carved through the rebel position with mechanical precision. The fighting that followed was brutal, even by the standards of Astartes warfare. Brothers turning against brothers in conflicts that had no room for mercy or quarter. The urban combat that spread throughout the palace's vast structure bore little resemblance to the ordered battles of the Great Crusade. This was warfare conducted in maintenance tunnels and service passages, in chambers where a single misplaced shot could trigger catastrophic failures in the palace's life support systems. Both sides fought with the enhanced capabilities that had made them the deadliest warriors in human space, but they fought without the strategic clarity that had characterized their previous conflicts. This was not war, but fratricide, and it left scars that would never fully heal. Valdor found his former lieutenant waiting for him in the Hall of Remembrance, that sacred chamber where the names of fallen custodians were inscribed in letters of gold upon walls of polished marble. It was a place of honor and memory, where the living came to commune with the spirits of the dead and draw strength from their sacrifice. Now it became the arena for a duel that would determine not just the fate of individual warriors, but the direction of humanity's future. Arcatus stood motionless in the chamber's center, his armor bearing the scars of recent combat, and his weathered features twisted with grief and rage. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. I trusted you, Constantin. I followed you through hell itself because I believed you understood what service meant. How could you throw away 10,000 years of loyalty for the lies of traitors and madmen? The accusation struck home because it carried the sting of truth. Valdor had betrayed the trust of those who had served under him, had shattered bonds of brotherhood that had seemed unbreakable. Yet as he looked upon his former student, he saw not righteous anger, but the desperate faith of a man whose identity depended upon the continued existence of comfortable lies. Arcatus was not fighting for the Emperor, but for his own sanity, clinging to familiar certainties rather than face the terrible freedom of acknowledged truth. The duel that followed lasted only minutes, but felt like hours, each combatant drawing upon centuries of training and experience to seek the opening that would end their opponent's resistance. They fought with the guardian spears that had become extensions of their will, weapons so perfectly balanced and responsive that they seemed to move with minds of their own. Auramite clashed against auramite in a symphony of destruction that left deep gouges in the marble walls and sent fragments of precious stone cascading to the floor. Yet Valdor found that his newfound freedom from conditioning had given him advantages that mere skill could not provide. Where Arcaitus fought with the mechanical precision of perfect programming, Valdor fought with the adaptability of genuine choice. He could anticipate his opponent's moves, not because he knew the standard responses, but because he understood the mental constraints that limited them. In the end, it was not superior technique that decided the contest, but superior understanding. Arcaitus fell with Valdor's spear through his chest, his guardian armor cracked, and his life's blood spreading across the marble floor in patterns that would never be completely cleaned away. In his final moments, his eyes held not hatred, but a terrible comprehension, as if the approach of death had finally broken through the conditioning that had blinded him to truth. His last words, whispered so softly that only enhanced hearing could detect them, carried the weight of ultimate recognition. "You were right. Emperor, forgive us all. You were right." The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as news of Arcaitus's death spread through the loyalist ranks. The remaining faithful custodians, deprived of their most capable leader, began to fragment into smaller units that lacked the coordination necessary for effective resistance. Imperial Guard regiments, their human officers unable to adapt to the fluid nature of the combat, found themselves outmaneuvered by rebels who knew every secret passage and hidden route in the palace's vast structure. It was then that the rebels discovered the true cost of the Emperor's psychic assaults. The massive mental attacks that had been directed against them throughout the day were not being powered by the Golden Throne's standard systems, but by direct drain from the Astronomicon itself. The great psychic beacon that guided Imperial shipping through the warp was being systematically weakened to fuel the Emperor's rage, its normally stable emanations fluctuating wildly as power was diverted to more immediate concerns. The implications were staggering. Ships throughout the sector were losing their navigational reference, stranded in warp currents that could carry them to destruction or deliver them into the waiting arms of Chaos fleets. The Emperor was literally sacrificing the Imperium's mobility and commerce to destroy a handful of rebels who had dared to challenge his authority. It was an act of cosmic selfishness that revealed the true priority of his concerns: personal power over the welfare of his subjects. The revelation galvanized the rebel forces, providing both moral justification and tactical opportunity. If they could reach the Astronomicon's control chambers and restore its proper function, they would not only save countless lives, but demonstrate to the galaxy that they fought for humanity's benefit rather than their own ambition. The assault on the beacon's heavily defended position became the focus of their efforts, drawing loyalist defenders away from other critical objectives. Civilian casualties mounted as the fighting spread beyond the palace's military sections into areas where non-combatants lived and worked. Scribes, servitors, maintenance crews, and the countless others whose labor kept the imperial bureaucracy functioning found themselves caught between opposing forces that showed little regard for innocent life. The rebels attempted to minimize collateral damage, but the loyalists seemed driven by a desperation that made such considerations irrelevant. The rebel assault on the Golden Throne itself began as the day's fighting reached its climax. Teams of custodians and their Mechanicus allies fought their way through corridors choked with the dead and dying, their objective the chamber where the Emperor's broken form lay connected to the machinery that sustained his existence and fed his growing divinity. If they could reach the throne and disable its systems, They might be able to break the psychic networks that bound humanity to its emerging god. Yet as they battled through the palace's deepest levels, the rebels began to understand the true scope of the forces arrayed against them. This was not merely a political uprising, but a war between incompatible visions of humanity's future. On one side stood those who believed that freedom was worth any price, that truth was preferable to comfortable lies, that humanity should choose its own path regardless of the risks involved. On the other stood those who preferred security to independence, divine guidance to personal responsibility, the certainty of slavery to the uncertainty of freedom. The Emperor's wrath had been unleashed, and it would not be easily contained. The palace that had stood as a symbol of human unity now burned with the fires of civil war, brother fighting brother, while the galaxy itself trembled on the edge of chaos. The rebels had won their first victories, but they had also learned the true cost of challenging divine authority. The war for humanity's soul had escalated beyond anything they had imagined, and victory would require sacrifices that none of them had been prepared to make. As the first day of open warfare drew to its bloody conclusion, Constantin Valdor stood in the ruins of the Hall of Remembrance, looking down at the body of the man who had been his most loyal student. The price of freedom was being paid in blood and brotherhood, and he could only hope that the liberation of humanity would prove worthy of such sacrifice. The golden chains had been broken, but the cost of breaking them was higher than any of them had dreamed. The deepest foundations, the ancient vaults beneath the imperial palace, had not echoed with the sounds of warfare since the final days of the Unification Wars, when the last techno-barbarian warlords made their desperate stands against the rising emperor. Now, as Constantin Valdor led his remaining forces through passages carved from the living rock of Terra itself, those same chambers resonated with the clash of weapons and the screams of the dying. The battle had descended from the palace's golden halls to its deepest roots, where secrets older than the Imperium lay buried beneath layers of dust and deliberate forgetfulness. The fighting in these depths bore little resemblance to the ordered conflicts that had characterized the rebellion's earlier phases. Here, in tunnels so narrow that only single combatants could advance at a time, superior numbers meant nothing, and tactical coordination became impossible. The rebels fought with the desperation of those who knew they had reached the end of all possible retreats, while the loyalists pressed their attack with the fury of guardians who had failed in their most sacred duty. Every passage became a killing ground, every chamber a monument to brotherhood destroyed. Shield Captain Navradaran discovered the first of the ancient artifacts, as his team fought to secure a flanking position through what appeared to be a collapsed maintenance tunnel. The passage opened into a chamber that predated the palace's construction by millennia, its walls carved with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. At the chamber's center stood a crystalline obelisk whose surface bore inscriptions in a language that had been dead since before the Emperor revealed himself to mankind. Yet as Navradaran approached the artifact, its meaning became clear in ways that transcended mere translation. The obelisk contained a record of the being who would become the Emperor, but not as humanity knew him. Here was documentation of a creature that had walked among the earliest human civilizations, manipulating their development through carefully orchestrated interventions. The inscriptions spoke of a psyker of immense power who fed upon the worship of primitive tribes who had guided the rise and fall of empires to serve his own incomprehensible agenda. The Emperor was not humanity's savior, but its oldest parasite, a being whose influence stretched back to the very dawn of human consciousness. The revelation struck the rebels like a physical blow, forcing them to reconsider not just the scope of their master's deception, but its duration. The being they had served was not a recent corruption of noble ideals, but an ancient predator whose entire relationship with humanity had been built upon lies. Every myth of divine intervention, every legend of heroic rescue, every story of miraculous salvation could now be seen as evidence of systematic manipulation spanning thousands of years. Yet there was no time to process the full implications of their discovery. The Loyalist forces were pressing their advance through the ancient chambers, led by the remaining faithful custodians, whose conditioning had proven too strong for doubt to break. The fighting that erupted around the obelisk was savage, even by the standards of their civil war. Brother killing brother among artifacts that had witnessed the birth of human civilization itself. Deeper in the vault complex, Magos Dominus Cole made a discovery that would have shaken the foundations of the Mechanicus had there been time to contemplate its meaning. The original webway gate, that portal through which the Emperor had intended to guide humanity into a new age of enlightenment, lay before him in ruins that spoke of catastrophic failure. But the damage was not the result of Magnus's desperate warning about Horus's corruption, as official records claimed. The gate bore scars that predated the Crimson King's intervention by decades, evidence of experimentation so reckless that it defied all logic. The truth was written in the twisted metal and shattered crystal that littered the chamber floor. The Emperor had been experimenting with forces he did not understand, attempting to breach barriers between dimensions that existed for reasons beyond his comprehension. The webway gate had failed, not because of external interference, but because of fundamental flaws in its design, flaws that the Emperor had refused to acknowledge, even as they led inevitably to disaster. The discovery explained so much that had seemed inexplicable about the palace's recent history. The constant presence of demons in the lower levels, the psychic disturbances that plagued the throne room, even the strange behavior of the Golden Throne itself, all could be traced to the uncontrolled breach in reality that the Emperor's arrogance had created. Humanity's supposed savior had torn a hole in the fabric of existence itself, and then blamed others for the consequences of his failure. It was in this chamber of broken dreams and shattered ambitions that Voldor made the decision that would determine the rebellion's ultimate fate. The explosives that his team had brought to destroy the Golden Throne's power sources could be more effectively employed here, in the chamber where the Emperor's greatest failure lay exposed for all to see. If they could collapse this section of the palace's foundation, they might sever the connections that allowed the throne to draw power from across Terra itself. The preparation work required precious hours that they did not possess, time stolen from the advancing Loyalist forces through acts of courage that bordered on suicide. Teams of rebels held narrow choke points against overwhelming odds, while Karl and his Mechanicus allies placed shaped charges with the precision of master architects. Each explosive was positioned to maximize structural damage while minimizing the risk to the palace's upper levels, where countless innocent lives hung in the balance. The Emperor's response to their desperate gambit was swift and terrible. Rather than allow his enemies to threaten the foundation of his power, the master of mankind activated systems that had remained dormant since the dark age of technology. Ancient war machines, relics of humanity's golden age, stirred to life in chambers that had been sealed for millennia. These were not the crude automata of later ages, but thinking machines of terrifying sophistication, constructs that had once served as humanity's guardians against threats from beyond the stars. The machines that emerged from their long slumber bore no resemblance to the simple servitors that performed menial tasks throughout the Imperium. These were weapons of mass destruction, clothed in forms of terrible beauty, their crystalline cores pulsing with energies that could unmake matter at the subatomic level. They moved with fluid grace that belied their mechanical nature, their weapon systems charging with harmonics that made the air itself scream in agony. The battle that erupted as these ancient guardians engaged both loyalist and rebel forces was unlike anything in the recorded history of human warfare. Weapons that could atomize Auramite armor with casual ease met shields that could turn aside the fury of dying stars. The very air burned with exotic radiations, while the stone beneath their feet began to flow like water under the stress of conflicting gravity fields. This was warfare as the ancients had practiced it, when humanity possessed the power to crack worlds and remake reality according to its will. Yet even as they fought for their lives against weapons that should have been myths, Valdor's team completed their sabotage mission. The charges they had placed detonated in a sequence calculated to bring down the entire Foundation structure in a controlled collapse. The explosion that followed was not the crude blast of chemical explosives, but a precise application of gravitational forces that turned the chamber's support columns into dust in the space between heartbeats. The collapse began slowly, almost gently, as massive stone blocks settled into spaces that no longer existed. Then, with gathering momentum, the ancient foundations of the Imperial Palace began their descent into the abyss. Chambers that had stood for 10,000 years crumbled like houses built of sand, their contents spilling into voids that seemed to swallow light itself. The sound was indescribable, not the crash of falling stone, but the groan of a mountain dying. Both loyalist and rebel forces found themselves trapped in the collapsing maze of tunnels and chambers, their enhanced reflexes barely sufficient to avoid the falling debris that rained down like judgment from an angry god. The ancient war machines, for all their terrible power, were crushed beneath stones that had been old when the Emperor first walked among men. In the space of minutes, the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace became a tomb for warriors and machines alike. Above them, in the Golden Throne Room itself, the effects of their sabotage became immediately apparent. The massive device that sustained the Emperor's broken form began to fluctuate wildly as its power sources failed one by one. The Astronomicon, already weakened by the Emperor's psychic assaults against the rebels, wavered like a candle flame in a hurricane. Across the galaxy, ships lost their guiding star and found themselves adrift in the treacherous currents of the warp. Valdor felt the palace shuddering around him as he led the survivors through passages that grew more unstable with each passing moment. Behind them, the ancient chambers where humanity's secrets had been kept were becoming one with the earth from which they had been carved. Before them lay uncertain escape routes, and the knowledge that their actions had irrevocably altered the course of human history. The Golden Throne was failing, the Emperor was vulnerable, and the galaxy itself hung in the balance. The deepest foundations of imperial power had been shaken to their core, both literally and figuratively. What rose from the rubble would either be a humanity freed from the chains of divine tyranny, or a species cast adrift in a universe where predators waited for the weak to falter. The rebels had struck their most telling blow against their former master's power, but the cost of their victory was still being calculated in the collapse of stone and the screams of the trapped. The war for humanity's soul had reached its climax in the deepest places of the earth, where secrets older than civilization lay buried beneath the weight of falling stones. The ancient foundations were broken, but whether they would support something better or simply leave ruins in their wake remained to be seen. The dying of the light. The Golden Throne had weathered 10,000 years of continuous operation, its ancient mechanisms sustained by a fusion of science and sorcery that surpassed the understanding of lesser minds. Yet as Constantin Valdor emerged from the collapsing foundations beneath the palace, he could see that the great device was finally failing. The explosions in the deep vaults had severed more than structural supports. They had cut the psychic conduits that channeled power from across Terra itself into the machinery that sustained the Emperor's broken form. Now, for the first time since its activation, the throne was running solely on its internal reserves. The throne room had become a scene of barely controlled chaos as techno-adepts swarmed over failing systems like carrion birds picking at a corpse. Warning klaxons blared from every direction, their urgent tones mixing with the prayers of those who still believed that faith alone might preserve their god from the consequences of mechanical failure. The air itself seemed to thicken with psychic pressure, as the Emperor's consciousness, no longer fully sustained by the throne's amplification systems, began to leak into the material realm with uncontrolled fury. Valdor entered the chamber with the 4 surviving members of his inner circle, their auramite armor scarred by recent combat, and their faces bearing the weight of terrible knowledge. They had come here not as the perfect guardians they had once been, but as executioners preparing to deliver a mercy that would be seen as the ultimate heresy. The Emperor's time was ending, but he would not go gently into the darkness. The death throes of a god would shake the very foundations of reality. The figure upon the golden throne bore little resemblance to the magnificent being who had once stridden across the galaxy as humanity's savior. The Emperor's physical form was visibly decaying as the life support systems that had sustained him for so long began their final shutdown sequence. Flesh that had once seemed immortal now showed the ravages of age and injury that had been held at bay only by the throne's artificial preservation. The master of mankind was dying, and his death would be neither noble nor clean. Yet it was not the physical deterioration that struck Valdor with the greatest horror, but the slow collapse of the psychic illusions that had masked the Emperor's true nature for millennia. As the throne's power failed, the carefully maintained facade of divine benevolence began to crack and crumble. What lay beneath was something far older and more alien than any human consciousness, a thing of hunger and ambition that had worn the mask of divinity for so long that it had forgotten what lay beneath. The Emperor's eyes opened as Valdor approached, and in them blazed not the warm light of paternal love, but the cold fire of absolute will corrupted by unlimited power. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the air itself scream in agony, frequencies that bypassed the ears entirely and carved their message directly into the listener's consciousness. This was not the voice of humanity's protector, but of its oldest and most sophisticated predator. My wayward son returns to witness the death of his father. Do you feel satisfaction at the sight of divine suffering, or do you finally understand the magnitude of your betrayal? The words carried psychic weight that would have crushed unenhanced minds, but Valdor found himself able to resist where once he would have knelt in abject submission. His freedom from conditioning had given him something that no custodian had ever possessed, the ability to stand as an equal before the being who had created him. The confrontation that followed was not a battle of weapons, but a conflict of wills, a psychic duel fought in dimensions that existed beyond the reach of mortal senses. The Emperor's consciousness, vast and terrible even in its weakened state, pressed against Valdor's mind with the weight of stars. He sought not merely to dominate, but to possess, to claim the body of his perfect guardian as a new vessel for his dying essence. The attack was not crude, but sophisticated, a careful dismantling of mental barriers that had taken centuries to develop. Valdor felt the Emperor's presence burning through his thoughts, like acid through steel, seeking the weak points in his psychological defenses where possession might take root. The assault was accompanied by visions of what submission would bring: power beyond imagination, knowledge that spanned the breadth of human history, the certainty that came with absolute authority. All he had to do was surrender his will to a being whose wisdom transcended mortal understanding. Yet as the Emperor's consciousness sought to overwhelm his own, Valdor found himself drawing strength from an unexpected source. The psychic bonds that had once enslaved him to divine will had been severed, but new connections had formed in their place. He could feel the minds of his freed brothers supporting him, their combined will creating a barrier against possession that no individual consciousness could have maintained. They had broken the chains that bound them to tyranny, but they had forged new links in the service of freedom. The revelation that his rebellion was not a solitary act of defiance, but a collective rejection of divine authority, gave Valdor the strength to resist what should have been irresistible. The Emperor's attempt at possession met not the mind of a single warrior, but the unified will of those who had chosen truth over comfort, freedom over security. The psychic battle that raged within the throne room was not merely personal, but cosmic, a conflict between the principle of absolute authority and the ideal of self-determination. As the struggle continued, the Emperor's physical form began to change in ways that revealed the true horror of what he had become. The illusion of human appearance dissolved entirely, revealing something that might once have been mortal, but had long since transcended the boundaries of natural existence. This was not a man who had become a god, but a thing that had consumed divinity itself, a cosmic parasite wearing the stolen flesh of its first victim. The sight would have driven lesser minds to madness, but Valdor found himself able to perceive the Emperor's true nature with clarity that his conditioning had never permitted. He saw the accumulated suffering of countless worlds, the anguish of species destroyed for the crime of possessing knowledge that threatened the illusion of benevolence. He witnessed the death of humanity's potential, sacrificed on the altar of one being's limitless ambition. The Emperor was not the savior of mankind, but its greatest tragedy, the living embodiment of every noble ideal corrupted by power. The psychic battle reached its climax as the Golden Throne's final systems began to fail. Without the artificial amplification that had sustained his consciousness for so long, the Emperor found himself unable to maintain the mental pressure necessary to break Valdor's resistance. The unified will of the freed custodians proved stronger than the fading strength of a dying god, their collective determination to protect humanity's freedom, creating a barrier that divine authority could not penetrate. In the end, it was not violence that destroyed the Emperor, but simple exhaustion. The consciousness that had ruled humanity for 10 millennia finally acknowledged its own mortality, its vast intellect turning inward as the throne's life support systems reached their final shutdown. The being who had claimed divinity discovered what every mortal eventually learned, that power, no matter how absolute, was temporary. Death came not as conquest, but as release, the ultimate freedom from the burden of unlimited responsibility. The Emperor's final words, whispered as his consciousness faded into the darkness that awaited all things, carried a note of something that might have been gratitude. Perhaps you were right to choose this path. Forgive an old man's pride. The admission of fallibility, coming at the very end, suggested that somewhere beneath layers of ambition and manipulation, a fragment of the human being he had once been still survived. That fragment welcomed death as an escape from the monster he had become. As the Golden Throne systems reached their final shutdown, the Emperor's physical form began to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to flame. The flesh that had been sustained by artificial means for so long could not survive the return to natural processes. Within minutes, nothing remained upon the throne but dust and memories, the physical components of a being whose influence had shaped the galaxy for millennia, reduced to their constituent elements. The silence that followed was unlike anything the throne room had ever experienced. For the first time in 10,000 years, the chamber was not filled with the hum of machinery or the whisper of divine consciousness. The Golden Throne sat empty, its screens dark and its systems silent. The God Emperor was dead, and with his passing came the end of an age that had defined human civilization since its earliest expansion among the stars. Valdor stood before the empty throne, feeling the weight of what they had accomplished settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead. They had freed humanity from the chains of divine tyranny, but they had also destroyed the only unifying force that had held the Imperium together through 10 millennia of constant warfare. The future stretched before them like an uncharted void, full of possibilities both terrible and wonderful. They had chosen freedom over security, but the price of that choice was uncertainty itself. The dying of the light that had guided humanity through its darkest hours was complete. What would rise from the ashes of divine authority remained to be seen. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the choice would be humanity's to make. The golden chains had been broken forever, and the species that had once knelt before gods would now have the opportunity to stand as masters of their own destiny. Whether they would prove worthy of the freedom they had been given was a question that only time could answer. After the Golden Age, the silence that followed the Emperor's death lasted exactly 17 minutes before the first warp storm struck Terra's orbital defenses. Without the Astronomican's guiding light to hold back the tides of chaos, the immaterial realm pressed against the boundaries of reality with renewed hunger. Across the Sol system, Vox networks screamed with reports of demon incursions and impossible phenomena as the psychic barriers that had protected humanity's heart-world for millennia began to crumble like parchment in flame. Constantin Valdor stood in the ruins of the throne room, watching through reinforced viewports as the sky above Terra twisted into configurations that violated every law of physics. The death of the Emperor had not brought the peace he had hoped for, but chaos of a different and more immediate kind. Ships lost in the warp without their guiding star were beginning to translate back into real space at random coordinates, some arriving as twisted hulks, crewed by things that had once been human. Others simply vanished into the void, their crews condemned to an eternity of wandering through dimensions where sanity held no meaning. The surviving rebels worked with desperate efficiency to restore basic imperial functions, but they found themselves fighting a war against entropy itself. The bureaucratic machinery that had governed 1,000,000 worlds for 10,000 years was collapsing under the weight of its own complexity, each failed system triggering cascading failures that threatened to bring down the entire structure of human civilization. Food distribution networks designed around the assumption of divine guidance ground to a halt. Military command structures built upon unquestioning loyalty to a single authority fragmented into competing factions. It was Shield Captain Navradaran who first proposed the solution that would define their efforts in the days to come. Rather than attempt to maintain the vast machinery of imperial governance, they would strip it down to its essential functions and rebuild from the foundations up. The Adeptus Terra would be dissolved, its myriad departments replaced by councils drawn from those who had proven their competence rather than their loyalty. The imperial cult would be dismantled, its resources redirected toward education and the dissemination of truth rather than the maintenance of comforting lies. The arrival of Robut Guilliman changed everything. The Lord of Ultramar had been leading relief efforts on the eastern fringe when word reached him of the crisis on Terra, and his response had been characteristically swift and decisive. His flagship, the Macrage's Honor, translated into the Sol system 3 days after the Emperor's death, its arrival heralded by a brief stabilization of the local warp currents that allowed essential supply convoys to reach Terra's surface. The meeting between Voldor and Guilliman took place in the Hall of Judgment, that same chamber where the rebellion had first expanded beyond its original conspirators. The Primarch entered with an escort of Ultramarines, his expression bearing the weight of loss and the burden of decisions that would shape the future of humanity. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of one who had ruled 500 worlds with wisdom and justice, but also the uncertainty of a son who had just learned of his father's death through rebellion rather than natural causes. Captain General, I have reviewed the evidence your allies transmitted to my fleet. If what you claim is true, then the being we called Father was not the savior of mankind, but its greatest deceiver. Yet the evidence of my own eyes tells me that Terra burns without his guidance, and the Imperium fragments without his unifying will. Was your rebellion worth the price that innocent billions will pay for your choice? Valdor met the Primarch's gaze without flinching, his response carrying the conviction of one who had paid the ultimate price for truth. My lord, the being we served was preparing to devour the souls of those same billions to fuel his transformation into a god. We have freed humanity from one form of destruction only to face another. But freedom, however dangerous, offers the possibility of growth. Slavery, however comfortable, guarantees only stagnation and eventual death. The debate that followed would be remembered as one of the defining moments in human history, a philosophical discussion between two of the Emperor's greatest servants about the nature of freedom, duty, and the price of truth. Guilliman argued for stability and order, for the gradual reform of imperial institutions rather than their wholesale destruction. Valdor countered with evidence of systematic oppression and the fundamental corruption that had infected every level of the Emperor's government. The breakthrough came when Magos Dominus Cavil presented his analysis of the Golden Throne's data cores, revealing the full scope of the Emperor's plans for humanity's future. The records showed not gradual elevation to enlightenment, but systematic reduction to spiritual slavery, the transformation of an entire species into a resource to be harvested for divine sustenance. Faced with such evidence, even Guilliman's loyalty to his father's memory could not withstand the weight of truth. The Codex Reformis that emerged from their negotiations would become the founding document of the new order, a blueprint for governance that emphasized accountability over authority and service over dominance. The Imperium would be restructured as a confederation of autonomous sectors, each governed by councils drawn from the military, civilian, and technical leadership of their regions. The Custodians would be transformed from guardians of tyranny into protectors of truth, their enhanced capabilities dedicated to preventing the rise of another despot. Yet implementing such reforms across a galaxy torn by war and confusion proved more challenging than conceiving them. The revelation that the Emperor had been a cosmic parasite rather than humanity's savior triggered civil wars on 1,000 worlds as planetary governors chose between accepting the new order and maintaining their positions through force. Some sectors embraced the reforms, their populations eager to escape the oppressive hierarchy that had defined their existence for millennia. Others rejected them utterly, preferring familiar despotism to uncertain freedom. The challenge of communication proved particularly acute in the early days following the emperor's death. Without the Astronomicon to guide astropathic messages, news of the transformation traveled slowly and often arrived distorted by the psychic interference of warp storms. Worlds that had worshipped the emperor as a god could not easily accept evidence of his deception, while those that had suffered under imperial rule often assumed the reports of his death were propaganda designed to lure them into complacency. Valdor found himself transformed from warrior to diplomat, traveling between sectors aboard ships equipped with makeshift warp beacons to spread word of the new order. Each world presented unique challenges, as local leaders struggled to adapt institutions built around divine authority to the realities of collaborative governance. Some transitions proceeded smoothly, led by administrators who had harbored doubts about imperial orthodoxy for years. Others required military intervention, as entrenched interests fought to maintain their privileged positions. The former custodians played crucial roles in these transition efforts, their enhanced capabilities and reputation for incorruptibility making them ideal intermediaries between conflicting factions. They had been created to be perfect servants of an imperfect master, but they became imperfect servants of a perfect ideal, the right of humanity to determine its own destiny. Their golden armor, once a symbol of divine authority, became a badge of service to truth and freedom. The work of rebuilding proved exhausting beyond anything they had experienced in 10,000 years of military service. Wars could be won through superior force and tactical skill, but the construction of just societies required patience, compromise, and the willingness to accept setbacks as inevitable parts of progress. Every decision carried consequences that rippled across multiple sectors. Every reform triggered resistance that had to be addressed through negotiation rather than violence. Yet there were victories to celebrate alongside the struggles and setbacks. Worlds that had been stripped of resources to feed the imperial war machine began to flourish as their wealth was reinvested in local development rather than sent to distant terror. Populations that had lived in fear of arbitrary persecution found themselves able to speak freely and worship as they chose. Scientific research, freed from the constraints of religious orthodoxy, began to advance at a pace not seen since the dark age of technology. The new Astronomicon, built around a network of volunteer psychers rather than daily sacrifice, began to emit its guiding light 6 months after the Emperor's death. The signal was weaker than its predecessor and required constant maintenance by teams of dedicated technicians, but it was powered by willing service rather than coerced suffering. Ships lost in the warp began to find their way home, carrying with them news of worlds that had chosen freedom over security and found prosperity in the choice. As the first anniversary of the Emperor's death approached, Valdor stood once again in the chamber where it all began, reading reports from across the galaxy that painted a picture of humanity slowly learning to govern itself. There had been failures and tragedies, worlds lost to civil war, and sectors that had chosen to maintain the old ways through force. But there had also been remarkable successes, examples of human ingenuity and cooperation that suggested the species might indeed be capable of the greatness the Emperor had claimed to offer. The golden age that had been promised through divine authority was beginning to emerge through human effort and determination. It was messier and more chaotic than the order that had preceded it, marked by disagreements and inefficiencies that would never have been tolerated under imperial rule. But it was genuine rather than imposed, earned rather than granted, and it belonged to humanity rather than to the being who had once claimed dominion over their souls. The former Captain General of the Legio Custodes had become something unprecedented in human history, a guardian who served not a master, but an ideal. The golden chains had been broken, and in their place grew bonds of mutual respect and shared purpose that were stronger than any forged in gene craft or conditioning. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in 10,000 years, it was humanity's to choose. Guardians of truth. 10 years had passed since the death of the Emperor, and Terra bore little resemblance to the world that had once served as the heart of divine tyranny. Where the imperial palace had once loomed over the surrounding landscape like a golden cancer, now stood the archive of truth, a vast complex dedicated to the preservation and dissemination of human knowledge. The building's architecture deliberately rejected the overwhelming grandeur of its predecessor, choosing instead a design that welcomed visitors rather than intimidated them. This was not a monument to power, but a temple to understanding. Constantin Valdor walked through the archives halls with the measured pace of age and responsibility, his once perfect features now marked by lines that spoke of decisions that had cost him sleepless nights. The auramite armor that had once gleamed with divine authority was gone, replaced by simple robes that marked him as what he had become, a teacher rather than a warrior, a guardian of knowledge rather than tyranny. The years had not dimmed his enhanced capabilities, but they had taught him that true strength lay not in the power to command, but in the wisdom to guide. The transformation of the custodian orders had been among the most challenging aspects of the post-imperial reconstruction. Warriors bred for absolute obedience to a single master had been forced to redefine their purpose in a galaxy where authority was distributed rather than concentrated. Some had struggled with the transition, their conditioning too deep to overcome, even with the techniques learned from the Thousand Suns. Others had embraced their new role with the same dedication they had once shown to their former master, becoming scholars and teachers whose enhanced intellects served education rather than oppression. The Hall of Memory, where Voldor now stood, contained holographic displays showing the true history of the Great Crusade and the Horus heresy. Children from across the sector came here to learn about the past, not through the distorted lens of imperial propaganda, but through careful analysis of primary sources and eyewitness accounts. They saw Horus not as a traitor who betrayed divine trust, but as a son driven to rebellion by his father's manipulation. They learned of Magnus not as a fallen sorcerer, but as a scholar whose warnings were ignored by a being who preferred control to collaboration. The education programs that emerged from the archive's work had become one of humanity's greatest achievements in the post-imperial era. Rather than indoctrinating children into blind obedience, the new curricula encouraged critical thinking and independent judgment. Students learned to question authority, to demand evidence for claims, and to value truth above comfort. It was a radical departure from 10 millennia of conditioning, and its effects were already visible in a generation that refused to accept simple answers to complex questions. Shield Captain Navradaran, now bearing the title of Law Keeper rather than military rank, approached Voldor with a data slate containing the latest reports from the outer sectors. His weathered features bore a satisfaction that had been impossible during their years of service to the Emperor. The Tau Empire has formally requested access to our historical archives, he reported, his voice carrying notes of wonder that such cooperation was now possible. They wish to compare their records of human expansion with our own, to better understand the patterns of species interaction. The relationship between humanity and its alien neighbors had undergone transformation as dramatic as any aspect of post-imperial society. Without the xenophobic doctrines that had characterized the Great Crusade, human worlds found themselves able to engage in trade and cultural exchange with species that had once been marked for extermination. The results had been mutually beneficial, as technologies and philosophies were shared across racial boundaries that had seemed insurmountable during the age of divine rule. Yet the greatest challenge faced by the new order was not external, but internal. The problem of maintaining unity without a unifying figure to focus devotion. The Imperium had been held together by shared worship of the Emperor, a bond that transcended cultural and linguistic differences across 1,000,000 worlds. The Confederation that replaced it relied upon voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit, connections that proved more fragile than the chains of absolute loyalty they had broken. Several sectors had chosen to withdraw from the Confederation entirely, establishing independent governments that ranged from enlightened democracies to brutal dictatorships that made the old imperial hierarchy seem benevolent by comparison. The leaders of the new order had chosen not to intervene militarily in these cases, accepting that freedom included the right to make poor choices. It was a principle that caused endless debates in the councils that governed the Confederation, but it remained fundamental to their philosophy. The defense against chaos had required the most creative solutions, as humanity could no longer rely upon the Emperor's psychic might to hold back the tides of corruption. Instead, they had developed a network of volunteer psychers who worked in rotating shifts to maintain barriers against warp incursion. These guardians were supported by extensive education programs that taught ordinary citizens to recognize the signs of chaos corruption and resist its influence through knowledge rather than faith. The approach was more fragile than divine protection, but it was also more honest about the true nature of the threats that humanity faced. The new Astronomicon had become a symbol of these changes, its light produced not by the sacrifice of unwilling victims, but by the voluntary service of those who understood the stakes involved. The beacon was weaker than its predecessor and required constant maintenance, but it belonged to humanity rather than to the being who had once claimed ownership of their souls. Ships that followed its guidance traveled not by divine grace, but by the collective effort of their species. Valdor paused before a memorial wall that bore the names of those who had died during the transition from tyranny to freedom. The list was longer than he had hoped it would be, including rebels who had fallen during the initial uprising and civilians who had perished in the chaos that followed the Emperor's death. Each name represented a life sacrificed for the principle that truth was preferable to comfortable lies, that freedom was worth the risks it entailed. He wondered, as he often did during these visits, whether those who died would have considered their sacrifice worthwhile. The question of justification haunted him in ways that physical wounds never could. The Emperor had been a tyrant and a parasite, but he had also been the only force capable of holding the Imperium together against threats that still prowled the galaxy's dark corners. In freeing humanity from divine slavery, the rebels had also removed the protections that slavery had provided. The Tyranids still devoured worlds on the eastern fringe. Chaos still corrupted the unwary. Orc wars still swept across sectors like natural disasters. The difference was that humanity now faced these threats without the certainty that had once sustained them. Yet as Valdor reviewed the reports that flowed in from across the Confederation, he found reasons for hope that would have been impossible under the old order. Human ingenuity, freed from the constraints of religious orthodoxy, had produced innovations in everything from agriculture to stellar engineering. Worlds that had been stripped of resources to feed the imperial war machine were flourishing as autonomous entities. Most importantly, the species that had once knelt before gods was learning to stand on its own feet, A young student approached him as he stood before the memorial, her features bearing the curiosity that marked those who had grown up free from the conditioning that had shaped previous generations. "Master Valdor," she asked, using the title he had reluctantly accepted when the old ranks became meaningless. "My teacher says you knew the Emperor personally. What was he really like?" The question was one he had answered countless times over the years, yet each iteration forced him to grapple with memories that remained painful despite the passage of time. "He was brilliant and terrible in equal measure," Valdor replied, choosing his words with the care of one who understood their weight. "He possessed wisdom that spanned millennia and power that could reshape reality itself. But he had forgotten what it meant to be human, and that forgetting made him into something that humanity could not survive." The student nodded thoughtfully, her enhanced education allowing her to process concepts that would have been heretical under the old order. "Do you think he loved us, in his own way?" Valdor considered the question with the same seriousness he had once brought to tactical planning. It was not the first time someone had asked, and it would not be the last. The Emperor's motivations remained one of the great mysteries of the age, a puzzle that scholars would debate for centuries to come. "I believe he loved the idea of what humanity could become under his guidance. Whether that constituted love for humanity as it actually was, that is a question I cannot answer with certainty." As the day drew toward its close, Valdor made his way to the highest tower of the archive, where a simple observation deck provided a view of the transformed landscape below. The city that spread out beneath him was nothing like the regimented magnificence of imperial terror. It was messier, more chaotic, marked by the kind of organic growth that occurred when people were free to build according to their needs rather than someone else's vision. There were slums alongside palaces, markets beside schools, temples dedicated to a dozen different faiths standing within sight of each other. It was not the perfect society that the Emperor had promised to create through divine authority. There were still problems to solve, injustices to address, conflicts to mediate. But it was genuine rather than imposed, grown rather than decreed, and it belonged to the people who lived within it rather than to some distant figure who claimed to know their needs better than they did themselves. The golden chains had been replaced by bonds of mutual responsibility and shared purpose, connections that were stronger for being freely chosen. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky above Terra, each point of light representing worlds where humanity was learning to govern itself without divine guidance. Some of those worlds had succeeded beyond all expectations, creating societies that surpassed anything the Imperium had achieved. Others struggled with the challenges of freedom, their populations divided between those who embraced independence and those who longed for the security of submission. A few had failed entirely, descending into anarchy or tyranny worse than anything they had known under imperial rule. Yet even the failures served a purpose, providing lessons about the true costs of freedom and the responsibilities it entailed. Each world that chose its own path, for good or ill, contributed to the growing understanding of what self-governance meant in practice rather than theory. Humanity was writing its own destiny across the stars, one decision at a time, one world at a time, one life at a time. Constantine Voldor, once the perfect servant of an imperfect master, had become the imperfect guardian of a perfect ideal. The road ahead was uncertain, marked by challenges that no amount of planning could fully address. But for the first time in 10,000 years, that road belonged to humanity itself, rather than to the being who had once claimed the right to choose their destination. Whether they would prove worthy of the freedom they had been given remained to be seen. But the choice was theirs to make. The dying light of Terra's sun painted the sky in shades of gold that no longer carried the weight of divine authority, but simply marked the end of another day in humanity's long journey toward an uncertain but chosen future. The golden age they had been promised through submission was becoming reality through struggle, sacrifice, and the stubborn determination to forge their own path among the stars. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all.